Hi, thanks for joining the API testing workshop. In today's workshop, we're going to focus on generating API mocks, functional tests, contract tests, and monitors all from specification files. Now, for the mocking and contract testing portion of this demo, we're going to focus on using an OpenAPI 3 specification file, which is the one that you are seeing on the screen now. This is a standard OpenAPI 3 spec file that has multiple endpoints in it. One of the ones, and the ones that we're going to be using mostly in the demo here, is the release notes endpoint that does require a version number in a query parameter. There's also a user endpoint that you can get by specific ID, as well as an echo and a post check endpoint. Now, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to load the spec file up into our mocking tool to generate mocks based on the definition in this spec file. So if I go back over here and just paste in my command, because it is quite long, I'll walk you through what this command is doing here. So the first thing that I wanted to mention is that our mocking tool is a containerized solution. So we are going to run it via Docker. So we will do Docker run, and I'm going to mount a volume that is basically my spec files folder. And I'm going to mount that into the specs folder within the container itself. And I'm also going to map my port 5000 on my local machine to the port 5000 within the container itself. Now you'll see quay.io/saucelabs/pystree. So pystree is actually the name of the tool that we're going to be using today for the mocking and contract testing purposes. This is a tool that we have built in-house, and it does a number of things outside of mocking and contract testing. And then I'm going to actually send my specific spec file, the one that we saw earlier. And the rest of it, what you're seeing here, has to do with the contract testing portion of this demo. But briefly, the logger command will allow me to send my results into the Sauce Labs API testing platform. And the last bit there, -- validate request, will actually validate the contract of my request that I make. So if I submit this here, our tool is going to parse through my specification file and generate all of the endpoints that we saw earlier to my local host based on, and have the responses based on that spec file that we provided. So I can just go ahead and make a GET request here to the release notes endpoint. So if I do this, and this is again going to just be on my local host on port 5000. And then I can go ahead and call any of the endpoints that we have generated. In this case, I'm going to use /API/v1/release notes. And if you remember correctly, the specification file does require a version number in the query parameters. So we will pass in a version number. So once I hit send there, we can see that my responses come back. And the response for these release notes is just this contact info for this email address and the text file. Now, one thing that I wanted to point out is this email address is being generated dynamically based on the specification file requirements. And so if I actually make this request again, we'll see that a different contact number as well as the text is being returned differently. In the case of the email address, we are generating actual email addresses that are Gmail and Yahoo. And so it's not just Latin like the text that's being returned. Now, the mocking point is really that you have the ability to take your specification file, which should be considered your source of truth, and generate mocked endpoints automatically from it. This allows you to do things like early testing on your API endpoints that maybe aren't quite deployed out into a server yet. But you do have a spec file, then you can go ahead and get mocks generated. You can run tests against them. You can even point these mocks or have your front ends point to these mocked endpoints. And so you can start testing your front ends against these as well. So there's a lot that can be done with these mocked endpoints. And a lot of it is just really helping you get started earlier and earlier. Now, the other side of this is the ability to test some third-party dependencies, right? You may have a third-party API that you're connecting with, and you don't quite have control over it. You don't want to be testing against somebody else's live API, but they have provided you an OpenAPI 3 spec file so that you can build your integration according to their definitions. Well, you can actually take that spec file, generate mocks out of it, and then be able to do what you want to do, right? You can modify the OpenAPI 3 spec if needed, or you can have it tested against without worrying about calling their live endpoint, right? So a ton of functionality here. Now, what I'm going to do is now jump over to the contract testing side of things. So the awesome part here is that I've already done all the deployment ahead of time and specified what I'd like to be doing with my contract testing. And so all I have to do here is actually make an incorrect API request, and the tool PyStree will actually validate that my request is incorrect based on the definition in the OpenAPI 3 spec file. So let's go ahead and make that request again, but this time let's not pass in that version query parameter. Well, now my tool is actually returning saying that there was an error basically, and that there was a missing field, and the missing field was the query param version. And so we can actually see that this returned a 400 because it was not the correct definition of the API call, as well as in the request, the response of the request we made, we got exact details of what the contract issue was in this case here, right? The missing field for version number. Now, we'll see how this connects into the platform in a little bit once I jump over, but I'm going to go ahead and transition over into the Sauce Labs API testing platform now. So let's just switch over to here. And so for the purposes of doing the functional testing and monitoring, what I'd actually like to do is shift away from the OpenAPI 3 spec file and actually give you a sneak peek of something new and I think really cool that we've recently come out with. And this is the ability to import HAR files. And so Sauce Labs is actually now capturing network traffic from the back end of your mobile real device testing that you're doing in Sauce Labs. And we're going to put that into a HAR file that Sauce Labs API testing can actually import, and then you can use that to do some generating of tests. So if I click on this button here, there's actually an import HAR from RDC job. Now I ran a job against a real device on Sauce Labs Device Cloud earlier today, where the backend captured a bunch of network calls. So if I click on this here, and this is the one that I made, if I go ahead and import that request, it's going to ask me to put this into a folder. So I'm going to create a new folder here and call this spec demo, right? Very simple. And we'll go ahead and create that. So I'm going to import that file into here. And once it's imported, it'll go ahead and refresh itself. But you can see that there were 3 API requests that happened in the back end of my mobile application that I ran on the Sauce Labs Device Cloud. One of the ones I'm going to select here, and we can actually click this into our HTTP client. We can see the request that was made, if there was any headers passed in, which in this case there weren't any, but we can see the full response that came back. So now I have an API call in the back end of my mobile application that I can now generate a functional API test from really easily. And all I have to do is click this generate test button and give it a name. And within seconds, the Sauce Labs API testing platform is going to take that, parse through the request and response, and generate a functional test for you. This functional test is going to validate everything that came back in the response, but also generate a reusable test for you. And so what we can actually see is that the GET request we made was automatically parameterized for you. So protocol, domain, and endpoint have all been parameterized. And if we go over to the input side, we can actually see the values here. We do this mainly to make it really easy for you to reuse these tests in multiple environments or pass in different variables. So for the Sauce Labs use case, actually, we have 2 different endpoints for this API. One is the API.us-west1, and one is for the EU. And so if I wanted to run this test against both environments, I can easily create an environmental variable here for EU versus US and quickly swap out those variables at runtime. What the test is then going to do is it's going to go through the full response, including the headers and all of that, and validate everything. So it's going to say, okay, well, my content type header was application JSON, so I'll validate that. But I also noticed that the API returned an array. So I'm going to validate that it returns an array every time, not a single object or something. And then I'm going to loop through that array, and I'm going to validate all of the objects that are returned. And not only is the platform going to validate that these objects exist, but it's going to validate that they are returning the correct data type. So in this case, ABI type is going to be just validating that it exists, but API level, we're going to say, well, it has to return an integer. Let's validate that it returns an integer. Or something like has on-screen buttons is a Boolean, true or false, and we're going to validate that. So things like manufacturer type can be an array, so we should validate that it returns an array, and then loop through and validate the objects inside of there. Screen size is a float type, and so on. And so we're going to go through and validate the entire response of this API here. And so if I go ahead and run this test, I can show you a full-on test report that's being generated. Now, this test report is going to show you the full functional test that we had just looked at and that ran. We're going to get an idea of did it pass, did it fail, where it ran from, when it ran, all of that. And then we get a full printout of the test itself, the GET call that we made, status code, latency, and download times for that API request, as well as all of the assertions being validated for that API response. For the request itself, we can actually click in, see the request details, the response stack details, as well as the full response of the API during the point of the test. So if there was any failures, I can quickly come into here, see my stack details, see the response of the API, and validate or debug rather what is happening here. So the other part of the functional testing or taking the specification file to create this endpoint is to create monitors out of it, right? So with API endpoints like this, you want to be monitoring them. You want to run these tests very frequently, right? The tests don't take very long to run, so they can be run on a more frequent basis. And so if I go ahead and publish this test here, you'll actually notice the scheduler button is now not grayed out. So I click into there, we have a built-in scheduling functionality that allows you to create API monitors. This will allow you to create a monitor that can be run directly from the platform. You don't need any external toolage or sources. And you can even run this test every 5 minutes if you wanted to. If you wanted to run it every 10 minutes, you can go ahead and do that, of every hour, of every day, of every month. And since we are over here, what I will mention is that we do utilize the Sauce Connect proxy tunnel. So for all of your secure APIs or APIs behind the firewall, you don't need to worry about this being a SaaS-based tool. It will utilize the tunnels to securely get into your lower environments and access those APIs. Now, once you've go ahead and created that schedule, the platform will then kick off this test on that schedule. So in my case, every 10 minutes, of every hour of every day. Now, once I have those tests created, monitors are only as good as the alert mechanism behind it, right? So what we do offer here is a bunch of ways that you can get alerted and notified that this test has failed or any metrics around that. The first way is just by providing an email address. You can provide an email address here, and upon failure of the test, you'll automatically receive an email notification telling you that this test failed and the ability to click on some details. We also have connectors that allow you to send data to external web hook sources, right? So if you wanted to create an integration between the Sauce Labs platform and your in-house analytics platform, or things like PagerDuty, right? So we have a built-in PagerDuty connector, which whenever a test fails, you can have it automatically trigger your PagerDuty on-call engineer. We have a few other hooks that are coming out template-wise. So we will have a Slack connector, a Microsoft Teams connector, as well as a few other ones like analytics platforms like Splunk and Elasticsearch and things like that. But we do have the generic one that you have the full ability to customize and build against any platform that you wanted to send alerts or data to. So you can even set this up to send success and failure data into any analytics tool that you are using currently. So let's go ahead and actually run this test really quickly over here, because I want to show you a couple of things. And so I've run this test now, and there's a test report. But if I go into my dashboard here, the big benefit of having a platform to do your API testing is that you have the ability to look back and get holistic results, right? You can see how all of your API tests are behaving. What does your failure rate look like? What are the failures? What does your metrics look like? We do have the metrics that say, here's your API endpoint, here's latency and fetch times, your status codes, all of that. So you do have the ability to come into here and get a historical idea of how your tests are behaving. I mean, you can filter this beyond the default. The default is 3 days, but you do have the ability to go and filter by multiple date ranges. You can choose specific tests that you want to run against. But one thing that I really wanted to point out is what you can see earlier is some of these tests that we ran when we were doing the contract testing side of things, right? So we can see this get release notes endpoint that we ran against, and you can see that the agent was Pystry. You can see that I actually ran this a few times, most of them successful. And then there was that failed endpoint where we put in the wrong query parameter. So if I actually click on the successful one, we get a report from Pystry that tells you all of the contract information, right? What was the operation that happened? Any info on the version and the spec, so it will tell you exactly what specification file you were using for this purpose, as well as the request information, like what was the endpoint, what was the status code, and then the response body. Now, if we actually go back and click on the failed one, we can see exactly what we saw earlier, which is, hey, there was a failure detected in my contract. And the contract failure was that I was missing the query parameter for version. And so not only do you have the ability to have your functional tests created in the platform from specification files like OpenAPI 3 or HAR files that you can import directly from your mobile testing, you can also come into here and get a holistic idea of, hey, how's my functional tests behaving, but also how are my contract tests behaving, all in a single dashboard, so that, you know, it makes it really easy for you to come into here and say, well, you know what, everything looks good, or there's some hiccups here, there's some problems here. And it just makes it easy for debugging and validating that your APIs are working as you've intended them to work, as you're doing your release testing and your regression testing and smoke testing and all of that. And so really the point I'm trying to make is that, one, specification files are important and they should be considered that source of truth, right? When you're generating your API tests, when you're doing contract testing, you should rely on the spec file to say, hey, this is how this is supposed to behave. And the other side of it is that you really should be doing all types of testing. You should be doing contract testing against your APIs, both consumer side and producer side. You should be doing functional API testing. You should be taking those functional tests and running them as monitors, running them very frequently so that you know when there's a problem with your API before anybody else realizes, right? Imagine a business critical API that you could know exactly when it's down before anyone even reports it, anyone has noticed any outages, and then you can quickly debug and fix from there, right? Having a contract test run against that same API so that you know, is it a contract-based error, or is it a functional error, or is it something else, right? That ability to have all of that in a single platform, in a single pane of view, I think is very crucial in today's sort of fast testing, fast building, fast releasing culture. And that's really what I wanted to show in today's demo session. I really wanted to thank everyone for joining. And then, we can go ahead and take some questions from here, or if you're interested, you can definitely reach out to us and be more than happy to do a detailed deep dive demo or answer any more questions beyond that. Thank you so much.